Dr. Sharma, my understanding is that Hinduism is a very rich philosophical tradition, um, and and then on the other hand, there's a sort of lived everyday experience, which maybe there's some kind of gap between the sort of higher kind of ideal philosophical teachings and the lived experience of the way that things are practiced, or you know, um, just sort of social conditions, people living in sort of poverty, or there being more sort of some social oppression happening, or you know, certainly Hinduism is not the only tradition that kind of has this disconnect. But I was wondering how you might reconcile those two
Yeah,
kinds of realities.
very good. That's a very important point. There is, of course, the obvious gap between theory and practice. I mean, just look at marriage. Uh, you just got married, so you know the transition from the theory of marriage to the actual living of the married life. So there is this gap. But of course, I'm being facetious in saying that. Though, of course, it's a fact that not all systems in reality live up to what they promise in their philosophy. If we might make some headway in dealing with this, if we distinguish between the economic reality, the poverty, and how we relate that to Hinduism, and the social oppression, the condition of women, and the caste system, untouchability, and so on. So let us first take the question of philosophy and poverty. The loftiness of Hindu philosophy and the abjectness of Indian poverty. Now, I think the connection, the missing link, in a sense, between philosophy and poverty is supplied by history. And what do I mean by that? There is a recent study, well, probably not recent anymore, relatively recent study, given the way we deal with economic history, by a person by the name of Angus Madison. And he was assigned the task of surveying the economic history of the world from the birth of Christ till modern times. His finding has surprised many. He concluded that till about 1500, India had the largest share of global output. Till 1500, let us say. 1600, it lost out to China. In 1700, it regained the lead. So we are talking about 1700, or around that time. And India's share of global output is usually put around 25%. But then we come to 1900, it's down to less than 4. So when you look at the poverty of India, there are only two really comprehensive explanations: imperialism or Hinduism. But when you bring in this historical fact that India was among the richest countries in the world when the British arrived, and one of the poorest when they left, then we have some explanation of the gap between philosophy and poverty, namely the imperial experience. But the question you raise is a very powerful one and a very poignant one. Some of my colleagues who did Indian philosophy or Hindu philosophy, when they would return from India after their first trip, would ring me up and ask for an answer, pose the kind of question which you posed, and would ask for an answer. So now we have some data on the basis of which we can argue that the link was not as negative as is supposed between the philosophy and the poverty, or the prosperity slash poverty, and that there is a historical experience of imperialism which accounts for that poverty, which is sort of somewhat confirmed by the rapid progress India has been making economically after it gained independence in 1947. So that's part of the answer. The other dimension of the issue is the relationship of that philosophy to the social reality, the lived social reality. And here, there are actually two ways of approaching this issue. One would be to argue that the position of women and the lower classes in India was really, until the modern period, under the arrival of the modern period, not very different in India when compared with other parts of the world. When you think of slavery and serfdom and so on. And so one could argue that once again, the villain could be imperialism. When people don't have control of their own destiny, they cannot really be held accountable for the social reality in the way they could be held accountable otherwise. But this is one point of view, and I think it has some merit. But one might probe it a little deeper, because the philosophy of India is very egalitarian and gender inclusive. If the ultimate reality is Brahman, which is there in everybody, the only difference between two individuals, according to that philosophy, is in what are called the adjuncts, what separates them in terms of body and mind. Essentially, they are identical. This is the basic philosophy of Advaita. In fact, even the difference between them and God is annihilated, ultimately. So such is the extent and comprehensiveness of its philosophical egalitarianism, you might say. One might say that and contrast that with the position of women and the caste. On this point, one can also make another historical argument. And that would be that Indian thought, actually, perhaps I should just say Hindu thought at one time was dominated by a worldview which was linked to a ritualistic perspective on life, which was called Mimamsa. And this school of thought argued that the main teaching of the Vedas, the foundational scriptures of Hinduism, is not philosophy, but ritual. And we can see how when it comes to ritual, then the issues of purity and impurity, issues of those who are qualified and those who are not to perform the ritual, and so on, become prominent and leave their mark on society. And that this was, in a sense, the social reality in the 5th or 7th century. After that, Hindu thought turned in the direction of philosophy. And since then, most of Hindu thought has been primarily philosophical. But that is very close to the period when India loses political control over its own destiny. And so there is a prolonged period of Islamic rule, Turco-Afghan, Mongol, Islamic rule, and then British Christian rule. The point I am trying to make is that one could argue that the social consequences of the shift in Hindu thought to the philosophical and to the kind of philosophy we talked about did not have the chance to work itself out. Again, because of historical development, namely foreign rule, which gravely affects a society's ability to change itself. So I hope when we take the historical dimension of life into account, then we make some progress towards answering the kind of questions you raised. So they are very profound questions, and we have to struggle with them as we think about the tradition.
In a more sort of abstract way, I think, like I said at the beginning, I'm not just singling out Hinduism, although that's what we're here to talk about, but that does seem to be a reality, that there's this disconnect between a tradition's like real between a tradition's sort of like philosophical kind of depth and richness and the way that things are practiced sometimes.
Yeah, in real life.
And I think that there's this kind of idea that as a scholar or a student of that religion, or even a person in, that you choose one or the other.
Yes, and I think it's a very important point, and I would not like to exempt even philosophical thought entirely from some responsibility in the matter. For instance, if you develop the idea of two levels of truth and an ultimate and an empirical, and focus on the difference between the two levels, you might create a philosophical disconnect between the high philosophy and social reality, because you're assigning them to virtually two different realms.
Right, yeah.
Now, of course, this could go either way. We have discussed this earlier also, that you might say that there is no real difference between the two levels, by arguing that the distinction between the ultimate truth and the conventional truth is ultimately conventional. Right?
But you might have to explain that part of it more. Ultimately conventional.
Yeah.
Please.
Oh, okay. So both in Hinduism and Buddhism, there is the view that there is the conventional reality, which we experience every day, and then there is the ultimate reality. And the ultimate reality may be very different from the conventional reality. We discussed the stock examples of uh, the sun going around the earth at the empirical level, the conventional level, but the earth going around the sun at the astronomical or at the ultimate level. And so it is then possible to think that they are two very different realms. But then one might say, if you press the point and say, but what is the ultimate reality? Then you will have to concede that it is the astronomical reality, which is the ultimate. And you are under some kind of an illusion. Similarly, then you will have to argue in terms of Advaita Vedanta that the only reality is Brahman. It cannot be compromised by saying that there is some conventional truth which is other than the ultimate. Because the distinction is conventional.
Oh, I see.
So then you will have to accept the fact that everyone is one. And that you will have to then maximize that reality at the social level. Instead of regarding the social level as a totally distinct realm, away from, distinct from. So it can go either way. Yeah. But these are the issues that I mentioned earlier we struggle with. And philosophy has to deal with.